we should get through the end of 18 and perhaps even into 19. But we're going to be picking up here at verse 12. Last time we talked about Jesus' betrayal in the garden, and we finished Jesus' prayer in John 17 for all the disciples. But we're going to continue on discussing his betrayal and what all is happening here with his trials, if you want to call them that, and then his discussion before Pilate. So let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for all that you bless us with. We're thankful for your word and the revelation that you've given, the glory that we see of who you are and of your Son and your amazing love for us and your desire to have sin removed from us and from the world. Help us to put you first and to give you glory and to follow you and love you and to obey you in all things. In your Son's precious name. Okay, so as I mentioned, we are here where Jesus has been at the Garden of Gethsemane, and he has just been betrayed, and we had the interactions where Judas came out and gave him a kiss, and Jesus responding with saying, "I am." The crowd fell back, and then Peter as well is one that he draws a sword to strike Malchus, and Jesus just told him in verse 11 to put your sword in its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? So let's pick up now in verse 12, and let's read this little section, verses 12 down through 14, about where they take him and who they take him to. So if someone will read that, verses 12 through 14.
Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. They led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people.
Okay, so who does he take him to?
To Annas.
Yeah, to Annas, okay? And he has a relationship to Caiaphas. So what do we know about Annas and Caiaphas, and why did he take him to Annas if Annas wasn't the high priest?
Technically, Annas was the high priest, but the Romans would sell it. And so Annas' family would basically buy it, but they'd have to put a new person in charge.
Right.
And so Caiaphas was his son-in-law. And so he technically was the patriarch, and he was the high priest first before all of his different sons and sons-in-law.
Yeah. So what's always not very obvious about it, Annas was deposed in about 15 AD, and Caiaphas was one that was priest from about 18 to 36. But he had been priest about 20 years earlier, and as Dan was talking about, you had kind of various parts of his family that all had the position, but then kind of leaned on him to kind of give that extra, or to kind of let him do his job. So actually 5 of his sons also were high priests. So just kind of, it was just in the family is the idea. And right now it's his son-in-law, Caiaphas. And so when you talk about this concept, Luke actually describes it as the priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. So there was just an interrelated idea in the family about what was going on here. So Annas is basically the one running the show. Now, what do we know about Caiaphas, other than, or I guess where have we seen Caiaphas already in the book? And what did he say? You remember? We're in John 18. We're not back in earlier, right? What did you say? Say something. He was back in chapter 11, if you remember that. It was right after the events of Lazarus and his resurrection. And let's remember what he said. Somebody read for us here verses 49 through 53, because it'll give light to what events are actually happening here and the mentality.
And one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish. Now this he did not say of his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but also that he should gather together in one the children of God who are scattered abroad. And from that day on, they plotted to put him to death.
Okay, so what was Caiaphas' statement? What was he expecting, or what was he trying to accomplish?
Save the Jews.
What'd you say?
Save the Jewish nation.
Okay, save the Jewish nation by,
Sacrificing one man.
yeah, by killing Jesus, okay? So this has been kind of the normal process, and what he means, as we talked about that a while back, what he's talking about is killing Jesus so that the Romans don't come and take their place from them. Remember, we've seen that kind of language as we've gone through and talked about it. But Caiaphas tells a truth that is deeper and more relevant than he knew. Because what's about to happen here is they're going to try to kill Jesus, and it is going to be for the salvation of Israel, just not in the way that he was thinking about it. In fact, if you remember when we were talking about John 11, one of the points we made is that you'll try to save your life, and you'll lose it. If you remember, that's what happened. They wanted to save the nation. The nation was destroyed in AD 70. And yet, what he predicted did come about. Now, there's another interesting statement. One of the things that was right there at the end of what John mentioned is that he was going to bring not only those Jews that were there, who else was he going to bring to salvation, bring to the Lord?
All nations.
Yeah, all nations. So he was going to bring them all together. It's the same kind of idea there in John chapter 10. So you have these concepts that it's more expedient that one will perish for the benefit of the people. So that's the mentality then that's going to go behind these trials. It's not about truth. It's not about trying to save Jesus. It's actually about trying to kill him. And that was his desire. And we'll see that as we go through this. I just hope that none of us ever go through a court case like this, because there was all kinds of mistrials. They were blatantly neglecting the old law, and it's all with an intention to have Jesus killed. So when you look at verses 12 through 14, we have these same concepts. He refers back to, in verse 14, the text that we already looked at. So let's continue. If someone will read here verse 15 on down through verse 24.
Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to be the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to be the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. You aren't one of the men's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest.
Okay. Can you go ahead and read down through 27? Get 25 through 27 as well.
Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, you aren't one of the disciples too, are you? He denied it, saying, I'm not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the garden? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow.
Okay, so when you look at this section, we've got this interaction here with Peter and another disciple. We have the sort of trials here with Annas, and then this going back here with the discussion with Peter. So what are some things that stand out to you? What kind of jumps out as you look at this section? Some observations that you see.
Peter did exactly what Jesus said he would do.
Yeah, yeah, for better or worse. In this case, for the worse. So it was exactly like he predicted. And there's some details about that, if you remember down here at the end, when Peter denies the rooster crows, there's some things that aren't mentioned. What aren't mentioned?
That Jesus looked at him.
Yeah, Jesus didn't look at him in this account. What else? Yeah, all it is, there's no reaction. Again, as we've laid out, I think part of that is because you would have already learned that had you read some of the other Gospels. Okay, what else?
Well, all of this is taking place illegally because it's the middle of the night, and court does not meet in the middle of the night.
Right. And especially if I remember right, when it came to capital punishment, they had to wait a day. There was a whole process that they went through before they did that, and that's obviously not going to happen, and it's very intentional. What else?
Striking of a witness that they're questioning.
Say it again?
The striking of a witness that they're questioning.
Yeah, you don't usually do that on the stand, right? So that's not usually the case. What else? All right, so let's walk through the text a little bit here. So Simon Peter comes in and with another disciple, and this disciple is actually known by the high priest. He enters into the courtyard, and he's allowed to enter. Now, who is this disciple, most likely? John, just because of the way that he's described a little bit later in the book, in John chapter 20. So he comes in, and he speaks there with one of the servant girls, and the servant girl talks to Peter, and we don't really know the tone, but perhaps the tone could be, you are one of his followers too, are you? Which is it kind of seems like it, and what's his response, obviously? No. Which is, again, when you look at this, why would Peter do this? Knowing what he said in John 13:37, I'll go with you even to the point of death, what has he gone through in just the last few minutes that might cause him to react this way?
He's already cut a guy's ear off.
Yeah, so...
He could be tried for that effect too.
Okay. What else?
Well, they're already abusing the law, so, there's nothing stopping them from doing whatever they want to do. So it's just like, who knows what could happen to me?
Yeah, so there's obviously fear of consequences. Think about what happened in the garden. Because he had said, I'll give my life for you. And we talked about this on Wednesday, that he kind of did that. I mean, they were vastly outnumbered. And he picked up his sword and basically was like, if we're going down with a fight. And what did Jesus say to him? Put it up. Now, what do you think might be his reaction then? I mean, if you have like an entire expectation of how one person is going to act, and they do the complete opposite.
He's still in shock.
Yeah, he's in shock in a certain sense. He's got to put together now just what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. Even though he's talked about this, even though he's predicted it throughout the Gospels. Remember, he was the one that said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And yet Jesus immediately started beginning to teach them about what it meant. He began this concept of, I've got to go to the cross. And remember, Peter's initial response was, God forbid, that will never happen to you. Now it's happening right in front of him, and so now there's this kind of distortion. There's this, kind of a misunderstanding, perhaps, that's part of this, that's also related to the fear. So Peter here, one of the things that is interesting is to note the contrast. So when you look at how Peter and Jesus respond under pressure, how did Jesus respond whenever he had the entire armies come around him and they asked him, basically, they came seeking for him. He asked them, who do they seek? Jesus of Nazareth. What was his response? I am. He doesn't back down at all. Now, you've got Peter, and he asks, are you a disciple of his? And it's just a servant girl. It's not like you have the whole armies there or anything like that, and what does he do?
Denies.
Yeah, he just falls down right there. And it just shows you, again, this contrast. But one of the things that I want us to do is, we got to be careful with Peter. It's easy to go through and give Peter a bad rap, and there's a lot to that, but he's not Judas. By comparison, he's still here, he's following, and Peter was never pretending to be a disciple like Judas was. Judas was a fraud. Peter said he would give his life, and yes, those words are easy to say, they're hard to practice. But one of the things that we look at is it's not that he wasn't trying to be a fraud. He's still trying to kind of work through what does it mean for Jesus to be a disciple and to have courage. And the reason I think that's important is because that's a lot of times where we are, if we really think about it, is we're trying to understand what does it mean that Jesus is the Christ. Now there's trials, now there's difficulties. I've got to have courage. I've got to go farther. And in those moments, what do? A lot of times we stumble like Peter does, and Jesus understands who Peter is, and he's going to ultimately restore him, but we got to realize, kind of put ourselves in that situation and understand the relationship that we have with God. Other things that we want to say about Peter and about these events here in 15 through 18?
Well, kind of going back to what you're saying about how it was just a servant girl asking him, it wasn't a whole army. Like, potentially there wasn't a whole lot of threat to him admitting it, but there was maybe some threat. She had gone and told someone. For us, when we face trials, I mean, what real threat is there to us? The
Sure.
way someone looks at us, some, disrespectful remark, or, even losing a friendship. I mean, it's really not that much.
Yeah, they're not going to haul us off to jail because you said, hey, I'm a follower of Jesus.
Right.
And yet we do the same thing. Somebody just asked us, and we're like, ah. Go ahead.
He saw that Jesus he was kind of caving in a way to all the authorities, and he saw that there was nothing coming from him, no big miracle to save everybody, and he realized he was in danger. He might be crucified as well.
Yeah, so there's a genuine fear. I think one of the things Dan and I talked about after class was the contrast between John 8, where everybody came, there was, the temple guards came, and there's a crowd of people that are wanting to kill Jesus, and that time Jesus just passed through their midst. And so Jesus has the ability to go through and to perform an escape act in a certain sense, but he didn't here, which again just kind of maybe gives another level to, or another layer to, why did Peter respond this way? Why is he responding with fear? Other things you want to say about this section?
Well, Peter took on the physical attribute of bringing out his sword. I mean, he was still thinking in the physical sense. He was still wrestling with the physical kingdom versus the spiritual kingdom.
Right.
He still really hadn't got it clear in his head that, yes, this has to happen so that we can proceed.
Yeah, it's
He
a
was still
kingdom.
wrestling.
It's not of this world. It's not like the kingdoms of this world. We're going to see that because Jesus makes that point. He said, if my kingdom was of this world, my servants would fight. That's what would be logical for Peter to give his life because he was convinced about it. But what Jesus is doing is so unpredictable to him, he's still got a lot of that baggage. Go ahead.
I've just always appreciated it as a cautionary tale, of our own humanity. That we have that faith and we believe what we believe, but in the end, when you're tested, you've got to really be able to step up to the game. Like, you really have to do that. Like, even Judas, I don't really see Judas as a fraud. My guess is when he started, he was buying into it, but then greed got the better of him.
Right.
Or his heart was changed because that had to happen in order for what needed to happen to Jesus had to happen. And the same with Peter. Peter was the number one out there with the sword ready to go, and then as soon as things got really scary, like I'm surrounded and I could die and I can't really defend myself. So it's just that kind of cautionary tale about humanity, and
Sure.
that you really have to know where your strength is.
Yeah, especially considering all the things that Peter had seen being with Jesus, and yet even to break at that moment. Go ahead.
I think it's a really good example of how often we are willing to die for him, but maybe not willing to do, and intellectually we think, okay, that would be the hardest thing to do, is die for him. And often the hardest thing to do is doing all of the simple, less flashy, less, but more inconvenient and more kind of day-to-day suffering kind of things that we have to do to be his followers.
Yeah, just confessing him by the
We're
fire.
willing to be that one that's like, yeah, in the Colosseum saying, you know, yes, I do believe in him, when it's something that big and decisive, but not necessarily willing to claim him to our coworkers.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's the example of him here. He was willing to die in a sword battle in the Mount of Olives, but not not be ridiculed by a slave girl.
Yeah, exactly. Other thoughts? Okay, good comments there. Let's talk about this questioning with the high priest here in verses 19 down through 24 for a minute. So the high priest questions Jesus, and he basically is asking him, who are your teachers, who are your associates? And we kind of do this. Like if you have someone that's accused of terrorism or commits a terrible crime, they'll probably go through and do this kind of thing. Like, who are your friends? Who was influencing you? Like, what teaching were you following? That kind of element. It seems that's kind of some of the understanding here. So they're asking basically what's leading you into this action, and what's Jesus' response about it?
It's all out there.
Yeah, I've been teaching it publicly in the temple, for crying out loud, and in the synagogue. Like, it's not like this has been a hidden thing, and we've seen that throughout the book of John, specifically in the temple. He's said multiple times, I and the Father are one. He's gone through, my Father's been working, I have been working. He's said these things publicly for them to understand. So it's one of those, it's in a sense it's curious, but it shows that they're not really interested in the details per se, or at least they haven't been listening to what was being said. So when you look at the statement here where Jesus goes through, he talks about, why do you ask me? Ask those who heard me, they know what I said. And then one of the officers strikes him and talks about how he answers the high priest. Now this goes into that whole high priest, who's the high priest thing. But when you look at what Jesus says, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? See, there was no disrespect here. Who was actually being disrespected in the situation?
You
Yeah, Jesus was. And obviously he gets struck as a result of that, as a result of him being disrespected, and then further disrespect on top of that. But as you look again at all of this, it's really clear this is not about justice. This isn't even about truth. What is this about?
power.
It's about power. See, when you go through and you think about governments, we'll see a lot of this as we go through chapter 18. When you don't have truth, what do you resort to? It's power. That's the only thing you can persuade with, is threat of force. And so you look at what's going to happen here. Power is justice. Power is truth. And we're going to see that as you kind of just walk through the rest of this section here. So Jesus ultimately does have the last word here, and eventually he's going to have the ultimate last word. So here now let's talk about this next section in 25 down through 27. So Peter goes through and he denies here the third time. Jesus had predicted this. And what's interesting about this is ultimately Jesus knew Peter better than Peter knew himself. And that's a pretty humbling thing for all of us, is we think we're going to be one way, and it's not always going to happen that way. And yet when God says something about us, like one that's coming to mind is Jeremiah 17, the heart is deceitful above all else. I should probably listen to that I don't need to listen to my heart, I need to listen to God. And we see that here. So he knows Peter, and there's a couple of things that are interesting about this account. So where are they at? What are they doing? We saw it down in 17, or in 18. they're probably still outside there at the fire. So it's early spring at the Passover, and we've kind of seen some of the time period for that. And it mentions in verse 18 that it was a charcoal fire. That's in the ESV. So I don't know, it could just say general fire in yours. There's a specific, there's fire and then there's a charcoal fire. Now, one of the things that's interesting about that is, why is he so specific? Well, it could be that it's just an eyewitness detail, but there's going to be something pretty interesting about this in chapter 21. Somebody look at chapter 21. We'll talk about it more when we get there. But in 21 and verse 9, what's kind of a replay of some of these events? What's happening in chapter 21?
Jesus returns and talks to them, is with them on a friendly basis, on a former basis.
Right, and what kind of fire is it?
Charcoal fire.
It's a charcoal fire. Okay, so there's a distinct kind of odor connection there. And so Peter's denial here is not going to be the last time he spends some time here, and this one's not going to be the end for him. And I think that's an important element as we've gone through and looked at Peter's account. We've seen how we can identify with him, and we stumble and we fall, but is that where Peter ends up at? Even at the end of the book, it's not where he ends up at. And so there may be times where we've stumbled. We've had situations like Peter here, but our story doesn't have to end like that. And that's an important element to look at. We can repent and we can change. So a couple of things, just kind of a bigger picture here. One of the things that I think is interesting thematically through the Bible is, where does the Bible story start at? It starts in a garden. Now, what's happening here?
Ends in the garden.
Yeah, the second Adam, the second Adam is in the garden making up for the mistakes of the first Adam. Okay? So you've got those kind of elements here. So if you're, in the case of Peter, you're kind of on that same line, you can be redeemed. You can be changed as part of that. But also, as you look at these elements, we see throughout all of this, we've got to be authentic in our discipleship. We've got to, whether it's Judas, whether it's Peter, whether it's Annas, any of these people, they can all be changed by the Lord if they'll just come to Him. They can be changed, they can repent, and they can be ultimately what God wants them to be. Okay, questions, comments, thoughts on that section down through verse 28 or through verse 27? Okay, let's read now verse 28 down through verse 40.
Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace, because they wanted to be able to eat Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then?" said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in the uprising.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, so when we look here at this section, what stands out to you? What's kind of curious about this section? Yeah, I mean, Pilate asked, what did he do? Well, we wouldn't bring him to you if there wasn't some reason for it. Well, you could say something, but they don't have anything, right? Okay, what else?
Well, just the dichotomy that they're doing things contrary to the law, the slapping of a witness, the trial in the middle of the night, the lack of delay, but then they don't go in because, nope, we can't finish this week-long feast if we go in, so we have to obey the law.
Yeah, we're fine with bringing a false witness against someone, and we're fine with murdering an innocent man, but please, we cannot defile ourselves before we take the Passover. There's just this enormous sense of irony that's in this section. What else? Any other things jump out to you?
Pilate didn't initially want to have anything to do with this.
Yeah.
And you see that.
I know he just kind of got dragged into it, and you'll see as the account goes on, basically they kind of just twist his arm into ultimately killing Jesus. He's not really that interested in doing it, but they kind of appeal to his friendship with Caesar. What else? Other thoughts? All right, so I think we've caught kind of the ironies that are here about not entering the Gentiles' home and about murdering an innocent man. But again, as we mentioned, there's no legitimate trial here or evidence. But what is the definition of justice in this section? If it's not true, if it's not charges, how do they go about making justice? I mean, it's all force, isn't it? It's, we don't like this person, shut him up, kill him, get him out of the situation. In a lot of ways, this really kind of reminds us of, if you remember Ahab and Naboth, and how they kind of grabbed a couple worthless people, went through, and just because he didn't like him, or he wanted his property. And when you look at one of the reasons that they gave him over was actually because of envy. They wanted to keep their own position, but they also, they just kind of wanted the popularity that was part of what Jesus had. So when you look at these concepts, truth isn't the issue. And so when you look at politicians just in general, this happens from time to time, where politicians, they'll tell whatever they've got to say to stay in power. And we'll see that from time to time. We'll see it in other countries as well. And so truth oftentimes is the first casualty in government work, just because of how the kingdoms of this world operate. When they're not driven by godly principles and they're not driven by the truth, then inevitably they're going to look at self-preservation and they're going to try to protect themselves. And that's what Jesus is talking about here when he talks about how the kingdoms of the world work versus the kingdom of heaven. So when you look at this beginning here in verse 28, it's early in the morning. From what I understand, they could start anywhere between 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. to try to be done around 11 is how the Roman rulers worked. And it was the day before Passover. Now, that's a bit curious here because what did they just partake of the night before?
Passover dinner.
Okay, the Passover dinner. So how do we explain what he's talking about here?
Well, it was a week-long feast, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So depending on how you look at it, it could be just the continual feast.
Yeah, and I think that's how he's using it here, is Passover becomes part of this whole Feast of Unleavened Bread. It becomes more than just a day, it's an entire time period as part of it. So when you look down at verse 30 then, again, they have no actual charge. They just say he's doing evil. Pilate doesn't care. He just wants to let them go and do whatever they want to do. But when you look at what he talks about here, Pilate said to him, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. And the Jews said, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Now that's a bit curious because aren't there cases where the Jews can put people to death?
Stone the fornicators and the adulterers.
Yeah, I mean, even, we've already got the situation with John 8 earlier, where you got kind of this kind of curious, is this supposed to be in the gospel, is it not? But still, they're wanting to stone. If they came into the temple right? I mean, that's one of the things, they can deal out immediate punishment there. And obviously there are times where they've already threatened to pick up stones to kill Jesus already. Okay, but they do have to appeal to Rome basically to go through their entire process. But what I want us to see here is that they're wanting more than just stoning. Because look at what verse 32 says. Somebody read again verse 32.
This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die.
Okay, so what is John saying is the reason why they said this and are having this interaction?
God is really directing the actions here because it was predicted, and they can't go with that. They can't go beyond that. They don't know it, and they didn't intend for it to be that way, but evidently they really wanted him hung on a cross, and they couldn't do that, so only the Romans could do that.
That's the idea. That's the idea. So when you look at what's the reasoning behind this, they're wanting more than just to kill Jesus. They want to have him crucified.
They want a public display.
And there's multiple reasons behind that. Now, just think about the word. When you look at verse 32, he mentions the word by what kind of death he was going to die. Where's Jesus already said this in the book? I mean, John 3, right? John 3:14. The Son of Man must be lifted up. It was set. It had to be done. It had to be done this way. In John 12, he says, when I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. This was part of God's specific plan. The Son of Man had to be lifted up. But as you pointed out, this is God's plan. John 10, Jesus pointed out, it's not that you have authority over me. I have the authority to lay down my life and to take it up again. This was all intentional as we've gone through and seen this. So he has the authority to decide this. So Pilate goes back in here in verse 33 and begins asking Jesus some questions. And so Jesus, as kind of characteristic in John, he responds with a question. So he asks him, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus asked him basically, where'd you hear this from? Who told you this? So if Pilate was hearing it from the people around him, saying that he was the king of the Jews, what might he have heard from the people regarding him being king of the Jews?
He's trying to set up a kingdom in place of Caesar.
Right. Yeah. So you've got that type of element. There's some type of rebellious element. So there could be a messianic type claim. We've kind of seen that. We'll see that in the book of Acts, that here's someone trying to raise up and gather a following. Also, who was the actual king of the Jews at this time? Herod. Herod was the king of the Jews in their minds. So whenever he's making these kind of statements, he's wondering, are you the king of the Jews? And is asking about some explanation here. So there's some clarification that needs to go into this. So if you're listening, though, to the people, they don't have a clue. And that's what Pilate is trying to Jesus is trying to help Pilate see. They don't have an idea of this. So he mentions in verse 33, or in verse 35, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? And so he doesn't say anything about what he's done. He just goes right on past it. But again, these are things that he's ultimately not going to listen to. So when you look, Pilate goes back outside, and they have this discussion. Oh, sorry. Let's talk about 36 here. So Jesus' answer here. He mentions that his kingdom is not of this world. And he mentions not being delivered over and this idea of, again, the kingdom not being from this world. So when you look at these elements, he's trying to explain a little bit about the nature of who he is and the nature of what he's trying to ultimately bring. So let's talk a little bit about Pilate and his relationship with the Jews, and then let's talk a little bit about the kingdom here. So when you look at Pilate, what was his relationship with the Jews? Did the Jews like Pilate? Did Pilate like the Jews?
No.
Okay, how would we know that just from reading in the Gospels? Yeah, if you remember in Luke 13, verses 1 through 5, he mentions that Pilate mingled their blood with their sacrifices. They did not like each other as part of what was going on here. So Pilate is going through, and what you'll see throughout this is he's going to be a bit mocking with the Jews. He's going to mention, behold your king, or here's your king. He's going to say those kind of things to them. And yet all of this, his reactions, all of this is part of God's plan. And so when you look at what is happening with the Jews, even though they don't like Pilate, what are they trying to accomplish by getting Jesus crucified? Part of that is that they are ultimately trying to put his death on them. Remember, they don't want to lose their place as a result of this. So they're going through and basically putting the blame on Pilate, even though Pilate doesn't have any interest in any of this kind of thing. Okay? So when you look at these questions then, when Jesus is responding here, in a sense, he's saying, do you really want to know the truth? Are you really interested in this? Because he says down in verse 37, he asks him, are you a king? You say I'm a king, for this purpose I've come. I was born, and for this purpose I've come into the world, to bear witness to the truth, and everyone who is of the truth listens to me. So when you look at these origins of his kingdom and the nature of this, he's trying to go through and say, are you really interested in this? Are you really dedicated to the truth as part of this? So when you look at Pilate here, what is Pilate interested in? What's his primary goal? Go ahead.
I think he's primarily interested in whether or not there's a physical kingdom he's trying to set up that would actually be kind of insurrect against Rome. And when he sees that it's not, and I think Jesus shows that it's not, he's like, I don't find any fault with what he's doing. He's just, I think he realizes he's just a teacher that doesn't agree with these people.
Right. And he hasn't done any of the things that they're being accused of. And ironically, with Barabbas, he kind of gives them the person that they are trying to accuse Jesus of. When you look at that word robber, that's the idea of him being like an insurrectionist. So when you look at these ideas, ultimately, what Pilate is doing is he's trying to save his life. He's trying to save his position. He's trying to make sure that he can kind of not cause a problem with the Jews while also appease Rome. But let's talk about the kingdom for a minute. What does Jesus mean when he says that his kingdom is not of this world?
It didn't originate here. He has a kingdom, but it's not the kind that would give challenge to any physical kingdom on earth.
Right. What we often say is we say, my kingdom is not of this world, and we mean that it's completely otherworldly. And that's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying that, yes, it's not of this world, like it's not of the United States or something like that. But it's still for this world. Just think about Jesus' prayer. Your kingdom come where? On earth as it is in heaven. Okay, so you have those same ideas here, but what he's talking about is it doesn't originate. It doesn't originate from the earth. Go ahead.
It doesn't work off the principle, like worldly principles. If we're going based on man's wisdom, they would be fighting and setting up a kingdom and that kind of a thing, and that's not what he's doing.
Yeah, which actually that should give us some light back on 1 Samuel and the book of Judges, how they rejected God as king. Like there was a whole mentality that God had brought, and they wanted to be like the nations. Now remember, Jesus has all authority in heaven and in earth. This is his world. He's the king of the United States. He's the king of everything. But it's not that he's derived his authority or his power or even operating in a way the world operates. Because he's not clawing his way to the top. He's getting his way through service, through obedience to the Father. So when you think about this kind of concept, again, this isn't the kind of kingdom that Pilate was expecting, and yet you can see kind of the reactions as a result of this. So let's talk here at this last section here. They find no guilt, and this custom here. So let's talk a little bit about the irony. We've talked about the irony in this section here. What is the irony then about Barabbas here, and why don't they want to take Barabbas?
Barabbas is a criminal.
Yeah, Barabbas is a criminal. Ironically, Barabbas is actually guilty of the things that they think Jesus is guilty of. Because this word, your version probably says robber. What I think one of the translations that was read, that he was one that was in the uprising. What this is actually connected to is the insurrection. He was an insurrectionist, or we might kind of put him in the idea of a terrorist or something like that. And that's what they're accusing Jesus of, and he's far from that. And yet, that's the person that they want to ultimately have released and ultimately do. Okay, other questions, comments on this? Go ahead.
I've always thought of Barabbas as being somebody that the Jews wouldn't have liked necessarily, but he could have been exactly the kind of person that they wished Jesus would be, kind of rising up and fighting against Rome and stuff like that. So he could have been somebody that was fighting more for the Pharisees' ideals than Jesus is.
Yeah, Jesus was anti-establishment with the Jews. That was part of what the issue was. Good.
I just always think of what he must have thought. Because here he is in prison, he knows he's gonna be murdered, executed. He hears a crowd getting louder and louder. I mean, there's several million people in Jerusalem at the time. You know, he might have heard them shouting, "Crucify," who knows? Then a guard comes and gets him and drags him out, and he's thinking, "Oh, it's time. They're gonna kill me right now." And then they're like, "You're free to go."
Yeah.
And then what a picture for us, because we technically are Barabbas, sitting there, deserving to be executed.
Right. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, and one of the things I think too, we're going to talk about this more in the future, but we got to ask ourselves the question that basically Jesus was asking Pilate: are we really interested in the truth? And if the truth means I've got to humble myself, if the truth means I may lose my position, or I've got to resist the crowd, am I willing to go through and to accept the truth, even if those consequences are like that? And we'll see the contrast as we go through this some more about the truth versus about power and those kind of ideas as we go through the trial more. Okay, we'll stop right there, and we'll pick up at chapter 19 on